Hello again. I know that I've spoken before about David Olusoga, who is the favourite historian of white liberals in Britain. Whether because of his heritage or for some other reason, nobody ever seems to challenge him, even when he's plainly wrong and giving a misleading account of the past, as he not infrequently does. I have been leafing through this book of his, Black and British. I spoke a while ago about the children's edition, which I found a little bit shocking for the propaganda it was pushing forward, but this one is intended for adults. I thought I'd focus on one subject about which he writes, which is the speech which Enoch Powell gave in Birmingham on April the 20th, 1968. This has come to be known as the Rivers of Blood speech, but of course Powell never used such an expression. Which brings us to the first disturbing bit about this in Olusoga's book, and it's on page 15. Olusoga says, and I quote, he's talking about, he's mentioned some of Powell's philosophy, and then he says, ultimately, these beliefs led Powell throughout the 1960s and 1970s to ratchet up his rhetoric, which led ultimately to his predictions of rivers of blood and civil war. Right, when you name somebody like that and then give their words in quotation marks or inverted commas, this means that you are attributing those very words to the person concerned, as I'm sure David Olusoga knows. The problem is, of course, that Powell didn't make any predictions about rivers of blood at all. He never in the whole course of his life used this expression. In fact, he quoted Virgil in his speech and said that, as I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. This was a typical classical allusion of Powell's. Does Olusoga know this? I couldn't say, but let's see what else he says about this speech. On page 513, he says this. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech has been analysed extensively, but what was perhaps most significant about it in the context of the time was that Powell did not couch his opposition to black migration behind numbers, as so many others had done. This is quite mad, for most of this speech was about that very thing, that is to say, the numbers. For instance, in 15 or 20 years, on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. That's not my figure. This is the official figure given to Parliament by the spokesman of the Registrar General's office. Then he goes on to say there is no comparable official figure for the year 2000, but it must be in the region of 5 to 7 million. And also, it almost passes belief that at this moment 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week, and that means 15 or 20 additional families a decade or two hence. So then we have, let no one suppose that the flow of dependents will automatically tail off. On the contrary, even at the present admission rate of only 5,000 a year by voucher, there is sufficient for a further 25,000 dependents per annum ad infinitum. Not couch his opposition behind numbers, indeed. That was his main point. Then we find Olusoga making two errors or telling two lies, depending upon the interpretation one places upon his words in a single sentence. No mean feat, I fancy. He says that in toxically racist language, he described British-born children of West Indian origin as wide-grinning Picaninis. Right. I'm guessing that the toxic racism he talks of refers to the word Pickney or Pikanini, as some say. This is not a racist expression at all, and certainly wasn't in 1968 either. I'm guessing, and I might be wrong, that because Olusoga is not a Caribbean, he is unaware that this word is still in common usage in Britain in a slightly abbreviated form amongst black people. It's different from what we now call the N-word, which was an unpleasant term devised by white people and used to demean black people. Pikanini, on the other hand, is a word which black Caribbeans invented. It is a self-description. It's derived from and cognate with the Spanish pequeño, meaning very small. One hears it all the time in Creole and patois in the Caribbean. Some Caribbeans, Jamaicans for instance, form plurals by using the singular form and then adding a plural pronoun. Rather than men, they might say demand them. In the same way, if I wish to inquire after somebody's offspring, I might say, how are the children? In Jamaican dialect, one might say, how do picnic them? The word pickney, a form of Pikanini, is not racist at all. That is sheer nonsense. What about the idea that Powell was describing British-born children of West Indian origin in this way, as Olusoga says? That's just a plain lie, or an invention, something he's dreamed up, I hardly know. Powell said, talking of an old woman living in an area which had become predominantly black, when she goes to the shops, she is followed by children, charming, wide-grinning Picaninis. They cannot speak English, but one word they know, racialists they chant. They cannot speak English. Does that sound like the British-born children of West Indian origin? Of course not. I honestly think that Olusoga is simply making this up as he's going along. On page 514, we have this. Powell had been characteristically precise in the language of his rivers of blood speech and had inverted the symbolism of history by describing the black man as having the whip hand over the white man. Right, Powell didn't choose that expression at all, as anyone that reads the text of the bloody speech would know. He was quoting one of his constituents. In the speech he said, a week or two ago I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalised industries. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, if I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this country. He continued, I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school and 2 of them married now. I shan't be satisfied till I've seen them all settle overseas. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. As I say, I have no idea at all if David Olusoga has even read the speech about which he writes here. If he has not, then he is a most sloppy and incompetent historian. If he has, then he is deliberately misleading people by saying things about it which are not true. I can think of no other explanation. I give a link to the text of the speech in the description to this video so that viewers can check for themselves what was actually said. They might incidentally find that Powell was extraordinarily prescient in his views over 50 years ago, but that's another matter. I might have more to say about David Olusoga in a day or two, because this book of his is absolutely atrocious.